The Hive Queen screeched in frustration as another assault on Earth's defenses ended in humiliating defeat, crushed under the boots and guns of the Deathworld's terrifyingly lethal human defenders. For eons, the Queen's swarms swept across the stars, devouring countless worlds with ease, until they found Earth. The wretched little Deathworld and its bizarre native species had repelled wave after wave of the Hive's fiercest warriors. Impossibly, the primitive apes slaughtered her finest soldiers by the millions. Even unarmed, the humans were deadly, ripping apart armored drones with their bare hands, surviving wounds that would kill any other creature in the galaxy. It defied all logic. Earth's gravity was only a little higher than galactic standard. Its atmosphere contained no corrosive acids. Its flora and fauna were laughably tame compared to the razor-toothed hellscapes the Hive had conquered before. Yet no matter how many the Queen threw against the humans, they just kept winning. What was their secret? What dark power hid behind those fleshy, sweating faces? The Queen had to know, had to dissect these humans and crack open the mystery behind their inexplicable power. For if she didn't solve the riddle soon, her swarms would break against Earth's defenses until nothing remained of her once glorious empire, but shattered chitin and fading echoes. Desperate for answers, she turned to an unlikely source, the dying thoughts of a captive human mercenary who called himself David Collins. As David's battered ship drifted powerless before a Zarantine dreadnought, its EMP still sparking from the shot that had disabled his vessel, the Queen's mind probed his fading consciousness. There she found flickers of memory, an impossible chase through an asteroid field, a handful of ragtag humans in a broken-down freighter fending off the Hive's mightiest raiders with an audacity that defied all reason. These fractured images hinted at something deeper, something primal coiled within the Deathworlders' simian brains. And for the first time in 1,000 millennia, the Hive Queen began to feel something utterly alien, twisting in her thorax, the icy claws of fear. The Zarantine guards dragged David into the ship's command center, shoving him to his knees before their imposing leader. Commander Murloc towered over the human, his chitinous exoskeleton adorned with the scars of countless battles. 6 compound eyes glittered with malice as they fixed upon David's defiant face. "Where is the Hive pod, human?" Murloc demanded, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "You will tell me, or you will suffer greatly before you die." David forced a cocky grin, shrugging his shoulders as best he could with his hands bound behind his back. "Hive pod? Never heard of it, Bugface. You sure you didn't misplace it somewhere?" Murloc's eyes narrowed to furious slits. He turned to his warriors, gesturing towards David's ship with a clawed appendage. "Search the human's vessel. Tear it apart until you find what we seek." As the guards scrambled to obey, Murloc returned his attention to David, looming over the captive mercenary. "We have ways of making you talk, human, ways that will make you beg for the release of death." In the cargo hold of David's ship, a group of Zarantine warriors pried open crates and containers, their antennae twitching with barely suppressed eagerness. Suddenly, one of them let out a triumphant hiss. "Commander, we have found it. The ancient Hive pod is here." But as the warrior reached out to claim their prize, the pod began to pulse with an eerie light. Hairline cracks appeared on its surface, leaking tendrils of glowing mist that curled around the Zarantine's limbs. The warriors stumbled back in confusion, their pheromones triggering a chain reaction within the pod's dormant systems. With a deafening crack, the pod burst open, spilling its contents onto the deck. A single massive figure rose from the wreckage, its exoskeleton still slick with amniotic fluid. The newborn warrior was larger and more heavily muscled than any Zarantine in living memory, an ancient breed reborn after eons of slumber. The warrior's compound eyes glowed with a fierce primal intelligence as it surveyed its surroundings. Instinct screamed at it to protect the Hive, to eliminate any threat to its queen. In a blur of motion, the warrior seized a pulse rifle from the nearest guard, its chitinous fingers closing around the weapon with perfect familiarity. Before the shocked Zarantine could react, the reborn warrior opened fire, scything down the guards with ruthless efficiency. Alarms blared throughout the ship as the warrior burst out of the cargo hold, its steps thundering against the deck plates as it began a relentless rampage towards the Queen's chamber. In the command center, Murlock's head snapped up at the sound of the alarms, his mandibles quivering with rage. A terrified subordinate scuttled up to him, waving its forelimbs in panic. "Commander, the pod, it's unleashed some kind of monster. It's cutting through our warriors like a plasma blade through wax." Snarling with fury, Murlock backhanded David across the room, sending the human crashing into a bulkhead. "Lock this filth up," he spat at his guards. "I will deal with the abomination myself." Drawing his pulse blades, Murlock stormed out of the command center, his eyes blazing with the promise of violence. Dazed and bleeding, David found himself thrown into a small, dimly lit cell, the door slamming shut behind him with a clang of finality. But the mercenary was far from defeated. With a grim smile, he reached into a concealed pocket, his fingers closing around a small, innocuous-looking tool. Ears straining for the sound of approaching guards, David set to work on the cell's lock, his heart pounding with a desperate need to reach his ship and escape the impending carnage. Sweat beaded his brow as he worked, his breaths coming in short, tense gasps. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. David eased the door open, peering cautiously into the corridor beyond. The dreadnought's halls were in chaos, filled with the screams of the dying and the deafening roar of pulse weapons. Zarantine soldiers rushed past David's hiding spot, too focused on the reborn warrior's rampage to notice the humans skulking in the shadows. Moving with the silent grace of a born infiltrator, David crept through the ship, his senses stretched to their limits as he navigated the unfamiliar corridors. His heart hammered in his chest as he ducked into alcoves and maintenance shafts, narrowly avoiding detection by the panicked Zarantine. After several hair-raising close calls, David finally reached the hangar where his ship was docked. The bay was in chaos, filled with the acrid stench of burning metal and the screams of the wounded. David dispatched the few remaining guards with brutal efficiency, his pulse pistols spitting bolts of searing light. But as he approached his ship, David's heart sank. The vessel was a ruined husk, its hull torn open by the Zarantine's frantic search. Consoles sparked and sputtered, the once sleek lines of the ship now a twisted mass of jagged metal. Gritting his teeth, David scanned the hangar, his eyes falling on a row of Zarantine shuttles. It was a desperate gamble, but it was his only chance. As he sprinted towards the nearest shuttle, a massive explosion rocked the hangar, throwing David off his feet. The far wall of the bay exploded inward, revealing the hulking form of the reborn warrior, its exoskeleton slick with the blood of its enemies. A dozen Zarantine soldiers swarmed around it, their pulse blades flashing in the chaos. Seizing his chance, David leapt into the nearest shuttle, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls as he fought to bring the alien systems online. Sparks flew from the console as he ripped out wires and circuit boards, desperately trying to hotwire the shuttle's ignition. With sweat pouring down his brow, David ripped out another handful of circuit boards from the shuttle's control panel. The sound of plasma fire and inhuman screeches echoed through the hangar, a cacophonous reminder of the reborn warrior's relentless advance. David risked a glance over his shoulder, just in time to see Murlock and his elite guard storm into the hangar, their weapons blazing. The warrior, its exoskeleton now pitted and scarred, acid blood dripping from a dozen wounds, met the Zarantine's attack head-on. It lunged forward with breathtaking speed, razor-sharp claws slicing through the air. Murlock's guards fell like wheat before a scythe, their armor no match for the warrior's savage strength. Green ichor splattered the walls as the warrior ripped into the Zarantine, mandibles clicking in a frenzy of bloodlust. Murlock himself barely managed to evade a killing blow, his plasma rifle clattering to the deck as he rolled to the side. The commander snatched up a fallen soldier's weapon and opened fire, the searing bolts splashing harmlessly off the warrior's battle-scarred carapace. In the shuttle, David let out a triumphant shout as the engines roared to life. The small craft lurched off the deck, its stabilizers fighting to compensate for the unfamiliar weight distribution. But as the shuttle nosed towards the hangar's shimmering energy field, A sudden impact rocked the hull. David's head snapped around to see Murloc clinging to the shuttle's exterior, a magnetized grapple locking him in place. The Zarantine commander hauled himself up the hull, his mandibles locked in a grimace of determination. With his free hand, he unclipped a plasma torch from his belt and began burning through the shuttle's armored plating. "Oh, no, you don't, you overgrown cockroach," David snarled, yanking the shuttle into a dizzying roll. But Murloc held fast, his grapple unbreakable. The plasma torch flared brighter as it cut deeper into the hull, the acrid stench of molten metal filling the cockpit. In the hangar, the reborn warrior finished off the last of Murloc's guards with a brutal swipe of its claws. Its compound eyes swiveled towards the fleeing shuttle, and for a heart-stopping moment, David was sure it would attack. But instead, the warrior coiled its powerful legs and leaped, landing on the shuttle's opposite side with insectile grace. As Murloc's torch burned through the final layers of the hull, the warrior reached down and seized the Zarantine commander. With a single wrenching motion, it tore Murloc free of the shuttle, grapple and all, and hurled him back into the hangar. The commander's scream of rage doppled into the distance as he tumbled end over end, disappearing into the smoke and chaos below. For a split second, David's eyes met the warrior's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then, with a final nod, the warrior leaped off the shuttle, vanishing into the dreadnought's war-torn corridors as the small craft cleared the hangar. David slumped back in the pilot's seat, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged animal. With shaking hands, he keyed in a hyperspace jump to the nearest friendly system, knowing he needed to report this encounter to his contacts in Earth's Defense Force as soon as possible. The stars blurred into streaks of light as the shuttle leaped into hyperspace, leaving the embattled Zarantine dreadnought far behind. But even as David allowed himself a moment of relief, he couldn't shake the image of the reborn warrior from his mind. Guided by ancient racial memories, the warrior was heading straight for the dreadnought's queen chamber, an unstoppable force of nature determined to eliminate the Zarantine's guiding intelligence. Deep within the dreadnought, klaxons blared and warning lights flashed as the ship descended into utter chaos. The reborn warrior smashed through one final set of blast doors, the reinforced metal crumpling like tin foil beneath its relentless assault. And there, in the heart of the queen's chamber, the warrior found its ultimate prey. The Zarantine queen reared up to her full height, her bloated abdomen pulsing with unborn eggs. Attendant drones skittered around her, their shrieks of rage joining their queen's deafening screech. Mandibles opened wide, the queen lunged forward to meet her challenger, the final battle for the fate of the Hive about to begin. As David's stolen Zarantine shuttle burst out of hyperspace, Earth's orbital defenses immediately lit up his comm with urgent hails. He opened a channel. "This is David Collins, former mercenary, now acting on behalf of Earth's interests. I have critical intel on an imminent Zarantine threat, requesting permission to dock and an immediate meeting with Admiral Hendricks." There was a momentary pause, then a clipped voice responded. "Request granted, sending docking coordinates now. Admiral Hendricks will meet you in the briefing room. Welcome back, Collins." Minutes later, David strode into the flagship's briefing room, his battered armor still stained with alien blood. Admiral Hendricks, a tall, grey-haired woman with a face lined by years of hard decisions, looked up from a holographic display. "Collins, I hope you have a damn good reason for this." David nodded grimly. "I do." Over the next hour, he laid out the full story of his capture, the reborn warrior's rampage and the chaos he'd left behind on the Zarantine dreadnought. Hendrix's expression grew darker with every word. When David finished, she leaned back in her chair, eyes hard. "If this warrior is as powerful as you say, and if there are more where it came from, we could be looking at a whole new level of threat." "Agreed," David said. "We need to act fast, find out what happened on that ship after I left." Hendricks was already in motion, barking orders into her comm. "Lieutenant Briggs, assemble your strike team. Full loadout, state-of-the-art everything. You'll be accompanied by Mr. Collins here." She fixed David with a steely gaze. "You're the closest thing we have to an expert on these things. Don't make me regret this." An hour later, David found himself on a sleek, black ship, the latest in stealth technology. Lieutenant Sarah Briggs, a muscular woman with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, gave him a curt nod as he strapped into his seat. "Hope you're ready for this, Merc." "Born ready," David quipped, but his heart was pounding. The jump to Zarantine space was tense and silent. When they emerged, the dreadnought hung before them, a shattered husk drifting against the stars. Its hull was pockmarked with explosion damage, great gaping holes yawning open to the void. "Scans show no life signs," the pilot reported, his voice tight. "Doesn't mean much with the Zarantine," Briggs muttered. "Suit up, people, we're going in." The interior of the dreadnought was a nightmare landscape. Corridors that had once thrummed with activity were now choked with the dead, Zarantine bodies ripped apart with savage force. Thick, dark blood pooled on the decks, the air heavy with the stench of death. Briggs led the way, her weapon sweeping back and forth. David followed close behind, his own gun at the ready. Every shadow seemed to twitch with potential threat, every corner hiding some new horror. Finally they reached the Queen's chamber. The massive doors hung off their hinges, torn apart by incredible strength. Inside, the carnage was indescribable. The Queen's corpse lay in the center of the room, her head ripped clean off, her egg sacs shredded and oozing. And there, amidst the ruin, lay the reborn warrior. Its exoskeleton was riddled with deep gashes, congealed blood oozing from a dozen mortal wounds, but as the team approached, its eyes flicked open. In a blur of motion, it lunged towards Briggs, claws extended. David reacted on instinct, tackling Briggs out of the way. The warrior's claws passed a hair's breadth from her face, the wind of their passage ruffling her hair. The team opened fire, a thunderous barrage of bullets, but they ricocheted off the warrior's armored shell, leaving only superficial scratches. It advanced, implacable, unstoppable. David's mind raced, then a memory, the Zarantine guards, their plasma weapons. He rolled, snatching a fallen rifle, and came up firing. The blast caught the warrior square in the chest. It reeled back, its exoskeleton cracked and smoking. But it didn't fall. Instead, it fixed its eyes on David. Something passed across its face, a flicker of recognition. It took a step forward, then another, heedless of the continued fire peppering its body. Suddenly the deck shuddered. Weakened by the battle, the floor beneath the warrior gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The warrior plummeted, vanishing into the bowels of the ship. "Rig the reactor," Briggs shouted, already moving. "This ends now." Minutes later, they were streaking away from the dreadnought, watching as the massive ship was consumed in a blinding fireball. The explosion rippled out, a silent scream of light and fury. On the bridge, David stared at the fading afterglow, his mind racing. The warrior had been defeated, the Zarantine queen slain. But somehow he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That somewhere out there, in the cold depths of space, something was stirring. Something ancient and powerful and full of rage. On the journey back to Earth, David stared out the shuttle's viewport, his mind replaying the final, brutal moments aboard the Zarantine dreadnought. The reborn warrior's piercing gaze haunted him, those ancient eyes flickering with a spark of recognition even as it lunged for Lieutenant Briggs. Questions raced through David's mind, a tangled web of mysteries he couldn't begin to unravel. As the shuttle docked, David was greeted by a sea of reporters and well-wishers, their voices blending into a deafening roar. Admiral Hendricks pinned a medal to his chest, her words of praise ringing hollow in David's ears. He nodded and smiled, going through the motions, but his thoughts were light years away, chasing shadows in the depths of space. In the days that followed, David buried himself in research, poring over every scrap of data on the Zarantine he could find. He haunted the archives, his eyes straining in the dim light as he sifted through ancient records and forgotten legends. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge, tantalizing hints of a long-lost warrior caste, bred for a war whose details had been lost to time. The more David learned, the more convinced he became that the reborn warrior had survived. It gnawed at him, a splinter in his mind that he couldn't ignore. The warrior was a threat, yes, but it was also the key to understanding the Zarentine's past. He had to find it, had to uncover the truth. Late one night, hunched over a flickering console, David stumbled across a cryptic Zarentine prophecy. Encoded within its archaic verse were a set of coordinates leading to a remote, uncharted planet. David's heart raced as he cross-referenced the data, the pieces falling into place with a chilling certainty. He went to Admiral Hendricks, pleading his case, but she shut him down with a curt dismissal. The warrior was dead, she insisted, and the matter was closed. David couldn't let it go. In the dead of night, he slipped aboard a small scout ship, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls. He plotted a course for the mysterious planet, his jaw set. The journey was long and arduous, the ship's engines straining against the vast emptiness of space. When David finally arrived, he found a world shrouded in mist, its surface pockmarked with the ruins of an ancient civilization. He set the ship down on the outskirts of a crumbling city, its once mighty structures now little more than rubble and dust. With his pulse rifle at the ready, David ventured into the ruins, picking his way through the debris. The deeper he went, the more signs of the ancient Zarentine he found, shattered statues, faded murals, the ghostly echoes of a long-forgotten empire. At the heart of the city, David discovered a vast arena, its walls covered in intricate carvings. He ran his fingers over the stone, tracing the outlines of Zarentine warriors locked in battle with fearsome insectoid foes. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the truth. These were the enemies the warrior caste had been bred to fight. A sound behind him made David spin around, his rifle snapping up. There, standing in the center of the arena, was the reborn warrior, its exoskeleton gleaming in the dim light. David's finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated. The warrior made no move to attack, simply watching him with those ancient, unfathomable eyes. Slowly, cautiously, David lowered his weapon. The warrior cocked its head, then began to move, its claws scraping against the sand. At first, David thought it was preparing to charge, but then he realized it was something else entirely. The warrior was communicating, using a combination of gestures and glyphs carved into the ground. Through this wordless exchange, the truth unfolded before David like a tattered tapestry. The warriors hadn't been wiped out by the Zarentine, but by the very creatures they were created to fight. The Zarentine had built them to be the ultimate protectors, but in the end, even the warriors' strength hadn't been enough. Faced with annihilation, the Zarentine had made a terrible choice. They abandoned their warriors, leaving them to die on the battlefield as they fled to the stars. The warriors had fought to the last, a final, futile stand against an unstoppable foe. As the weight of this revelation sank in, David looked at the reborn warrior with new eyes. It was the last of its kind, a relic of a forgotten age, driven by an ancient purpose it could never fulfill. In that moment, he saw the warrior not as a threat, but as a tragic figure, condemned to an existence of endless battle and loss. The warrior reached out, pressing something into David's hand. He looked down to see a small crystalline object, its surface etched with intricate patterns. A data storage device, he realized, containing the full history of the warrior caste and their sacrifice. With a solemn nod, the warrior turned and walked away, its steps heavy with the weight of ages. David watched it go, the device clutched tight in his fist. He knew what he had to do. The journey back to Earth was a blur, David's mind racing with the implications of his discovery. When he finally stood before Admiral Hendricks, the data device in his hand, he thought she would be elated. The information it contained could change the course of the war, give humanity an edge against the Zarentine. But as David looked into the Admiral's eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Hunger, greed, the same base instincts that had driven the Zarentine to betray their own protectors. In that instant, David knew he couldn't trust her, couldn't trust anyone with the knowledge he held. Without a word, he crushed the device in his fist, the crystalline shards biting into his palm. Admiral Hendricks's face contorted with rage, her shouts of fury echoing off the walls. David simply shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. He walked out of the command center, ignoring the shouts and threats that followed him. He made his way to the cliffs beyond the base, the ocean stretching out before him like a vast, endless void. As he stood there, the wind whipping at his face, David felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had borne witness to a tragedy, a tale of sacrifice and betrayal that would be forever lost to history. But in the end, perhaps that was for the best. Some secrets, he realized, were too heavy to bear. Some burdens were meant to be carried alone, the weight of memory etched into the soul. And so David stood, the last keeper of the warrior's legacy, staring out at the stars that had borne witness to their final, desperate stand. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky fading to a deep inky black. David closed his eyes, the warrior's sacrifice playing out behind his lids in a silent, eternal loop. He knew he would carry this moment with him for the rest of his days, a reminder of the cost of survival in a galaxy where betrayal lurked around every corner. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.